According to the United Nations, the Taliban is now fighting for power in more areas in Afghanistan than has been seen since the US invasion took place in 2001. The fragile security situation is one of the reasons the United States says it will keep thousands of troops in the country into 2017 in support of the Afghan government. In late September, Taliban fighters briefly took over the northern city of Kunduz before being driven out by Afghan security forces. The fall of Kunduz was a major victory for the Taliban insurgency in its attempt to expand beyond its rural strongholds. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani says outside groups are to blame.
Fighting in Kunduz is not an internal or tribal dispute. A high number of international terrorism networks have focused on and are present in Kunduz. A high number of international terrorism networks have focused on and are present in Kunduz. These international terrorism networks, such as Uzbek or Chechen rebels, have nothing to do with Afghanistan, but they are fighting to turn our country into a battlefield.
Joining us now from Kabul is Omar Samad. He's an Afghan diplomat and the senior advisor to Afghan Chief Executive Officer Abdullah. With us here in Washington, D.C. is Hamid Arsalan. He's an Afghan analyst and a program officer for Middle East and North Africa programs at the National Endowment for Democracy. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Ambassador Samad, let me start with you. President Obama recently announced that the United States will keep troops in Afghanistan, 10,000 next year, going down to 5,500 in 2017. What is Afghanistan's response to that announcement?
Afghanistan's response overall is positive. It has welcomed the decision by the US president, not only the government, but I think society as a whole. We don't see any reaction to the contrary. But of course, the Taliban and those who are continuing to fight and their affiliates are not happy about it, and they have opposed it. But this was an important decision at an important time. And we know that it was not probably an easy decision by the US administration, but they did take into reality and into account the realities on the ground in Afghanistan. We are still faced with some security challenges, some serious ones in some parts of the country. The Taliban, after we found out that their leader had died a long time ago, are going through some type of leadership crisis. They're trying to resolve it, but at the same time, they have ordered the troops to continue to attack and try to create mayhem to the extent possible. So any chances or opportunities for talks or reconciliation at this moment is very mute and non-existent.
Hamid, what is your view on that United States decision? As the ambassador pointed out, it could not have been an easy decision. What do you think motivated it?
No, I actually absolutely agree with the ambassador's views. I just want to add two more points of this significant decision by President Obama. I think the president's decision to keep troops in Afghanistan through 2016 and beyond that in 2017 sends two other messages to the region as well. One, to the Taliban and their backers. We all know that they have often said that if we have the watches, we have all the time and we will wait. It would send them that message that, we are not going to abandon Afghanistan like, the late 1980s. And it will also send a message to the Afghan government and the Afghan partners, and especially the Afghan people, that we are here to stay and support Afghanistan throughout this transition. The second point that I think is very important is that this decision, President Obama has always wanted to end this war when he's out of the office. The fact that he will keep some troops in Afghanistan through 2017 and leaving that decision to the next president of the United States, whoever he or she may be, I think is significant as well. As you know, we both know here in Washington, once you pull all the troops out of a country, it's extremely difficult to go and redeploy troops in that country. So I think it will be significant. It's really not about the numbers, how many troops will stay in Afghanistan. It's truly, in my view, the political message that this decision will send, not only to Afghanistan, but to the region.
Ambassador, do you agree? Is this a political message that's being sent to the region, or is it, in fact, about troop strength? I mean, we're talking about 10,000 troops next year, 5,500 in 2017. If given the chance, would Afghanistan want to see more troops?
It's a message to all the stakeholders, including the Afghans, as well as those in our region who are involved in one way or the other, either positively or negatively. I think that it's a very strong message to the Taliban and all those outfits that support the Taliban that the international community is committed to Afghanistan's stability and security. We do, remember, we do have a BSA, or a bilateral security agreement, as part of a strategic agreement with the United States that basically says that the United States / NATO, because there's a separate one with NATO, will assist Afghanistan for some years to come, not only on the security front, but as well as on the development and aid fronts as well. So I think that the message to the Afghan people is that you do not need to worry if you think that your forces, even though they are really up to the fighting and they have done an incredible job with very high casualty rates to defend the country, but that they still need the enablers and the more sophisticated military and security and intelligence gear that is needed to protect them, as well as to carry out counter-terrorism operations. And Afghanistan still lacks, for example, an air force and some more sophisticated intelligence gathering mechanisms. So this will assure the Afghan people that they are not alone, and that until we ourselves find those capabilities as well as develop those capabilities, the Americans, NATO, and others will be with us.
Right, Hamid, so on the one hand, we have what the United States is doing, essentially a response to what is happening in Afghanistan. But let's look at the military picture in the country there right now. The United Nations says that the Taliban is now in more areas in Afghanistan since the invasion by the United States 14 years ago. How did it get to that point?
Oh, well, we have to look at a few things. Now, the Taliban, a couple of years ago, we had more than 100,000 international troops who were in Afghanistan, and their sole purpose was to conduct counterterrorism operations. We don't have that force now in Afghanistan, so that means that the whole responsibility is on the Afghan forces, and as the ambassador mentioned, the Afghans have been doing a remarkable job in many ways to fight that. When these troops left Afghanistan, the belief in the region was that the Afghan forces will not be able to hold grounds. The Taliban leadership in Pakistan, with their packers in the region, they decided that at least during the summer, which is the fighting season for the Taliban, that you take over 6 provinces from Afghanistan. And they tried. And we have seen the unfortunate fall of Kunduz as one of those reasons. So one is, that this 100,000 plus troops that were in Afghanistan, they are no longer there to provide assistance to the Afghan security forces. The second front is that when Pakistanis, they launched this Zarb-e-Azad operation in Waziristan area, it has pushed a lot of the international terrorists, Al-Qaeda affiliates, some other foreign fighters, Pakistani foreign fighters, and it pushed them inside Afghanistan. And as a result, that has emboldened the Afghan Taliban as well. They have been stationed mostly, in northeast of Afghanistan, in the provinces of Kunduz, Faryab, Badakhshan. And so they're launching bigger attacks basically against the Afghan security forces. But as the ambassador mentioned, the Afghan security forces, they have truly, bravely, they have been fighting this enemy. During the first 6 months of this year alone, we had more than 6,000 casualties. So it's not about the will of the Afghan troops. They believe in this fight, they fight them, but they do need continued international support. And as the ambassador mentioned, especially when it comes to air support, to intelligence, to logistics, and so forth.
Ambassador, Kunduz was a provincial capital that was briefly taken over by the Taliban. Afghan national forces did regain control of the town, but to what extent was that a setback, and does it raise the question of how confident is the government that Afghan security forces can keep the security in the country?
The level of confidence is very high, and I can tell you that by being here and watching the situation close up. Kunduz was somewhat of an exception, and we hope that it will not repeat itself anywhere else in Afghanistan. I think that we all have learned many lessons from Kunduz. Kunduz is a very complex situation. It didn't happen overnight. It was a festering wound that sort of had been in the open for more than a year or two. Remember, in the last 2-3 years of Mr. Karzai's presidency, he had put a ban on almost all special operations, all nighttime operations, and he had also opened the gates of many prisons in Afghanistan and released not only a few probably innocent people, but many Taliban, people who had been captured on the battlegrounds. A lot of these people ended up in Kunduz. Aside from what Mr. Arsalan said correctly, thousands of others were pushed from Pakistan's side into Afghanistan. And then there were some governance issues associated with some level of lack of coordination within the Afghan forces. We have to admit that as well. So we are taking corrective measures. We are trying to learn the lessons, and we're trying to make sure that it doesn't repeat itself anywhere else.
I mean, if we look at some of the alternatives that are being pursued, I mean, one of them is talks with the Taliban. Those talks had been taking place. They broke down. What are the chances of those talks resuming soon?
It's a good question, and I think especially when President Ghani, when he came to office, he has tried very hard to convince more than the Taliban, the Pakistanis, that I am really genuine and I want to have peace in Afghanistan. As you know, the Afghans, we have had 4 decades of war and conflict, and they really are tired. They want to have peace. When President Ghani was in Pakistan, he even broke protocol by going to the army chief's office, to see General Sharif, because he knows that at the end of the day that it's Pakistani military that is calling the shots when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to the Taliban. As the ambassador was mentioned earlier regarding the recent talks in Mari, where Mullah Omar, was dead for the last 2.5 years as well. So that's really kind of pushed the talks backward. What the Afghan government have been asking the Pakistanis is that previously the Pakistanis were saying that we don't have any control over the Taliban. We don't know we don't think that the leadership is in Pakistan, but now they admit. And the fact that they brought the Taliban to the negotiating table in Mari talks is significant itself. But what the Afghan government has been asking is that these talks, they haven't been genuine. Just a few days after those talks, a truck bomb went off in Afghanistan that took 400+ casualties. And the people who plot those attacks, they were inside Pakistan. So what the Afghan government have been asking the Pakistanis is that treat the Afghan Taliban the same as we are treating the Pakistani Taliban and other insurgents who are operating in Pakistan.
Right,
that there are no good or bad Taliban. If they are not willing to accept the talks, then go after them, eliminate their sanctuaries and eliminate their leaderships.
Right. Ambassador Samad, we have the United States, which has been a key player in Afghanistan for a very long time. But now, as you look ahead to stabilizing the country, to finding peace in the country, what role is there for regional powers? And I'm thinking of powers like China, India, Pakistan, of course, and Russia as well.
Yes. Listen, I think that there's a role for anyone who is somewhat sincere about bringing peace and stability to Afghanistan, which means peace and stability to the region. And we have seen many of the regional players, including China, play a constructive role as a facilitator. The Indians and the Russians and the Iranians all have always supported peace talks that are Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. What we did find out, unfortunately, back in July, after it was revealed that Mullah Omar had been dead for 2.5 years, and no one knew it except for the Pakistanis who were aware of it from their own intelligence sources and had not shared it with anyone, is that you need trust. You can't engage in peace talks while you're being attacked at the same time while the trust factor is diminished. We need to rebuild the trust factor. We need to make sure that what we say corresponds to what we do, that actions speak louder than words. And I think that tomorrow we have the Chinese Vice President coming to Kabul, and we will have very important discussions with him on what else China can do. And we are hoping that China will add to its good offices and use that in order to bring all the key players around the table. But it's not just China, it's the US as well. It's the Pakistanis at the end of the day who would have to decide on whether we are going to continue the same game as we have for many years, or we're going to shift to something that is more constructive and more positive for everyone, including Pakistan.
Ambassador Omar Samad, Hamid Arsalan, thanks to both of you for joining us.